The clock on the dashboard read 11 p.m. Jason Miller pulled the sedan to the curb, the air inside the vehicle thick with the scent of pepperoni and stale heat. He climbed out, navigated the porch steps, and handed the cardboard box to a customer who barely glanced up. A $5 bill changed hands. Jason tucked the cash into his pocket, walked back to the car, and started the engine. It rattled, a familiar sound that had accompanied him through every delivery this week. While his coworkers clocked out and headed straight for the neon lights of the bar to burn their tips, Jason drove in the opposite direction. He pulled into his apartment complex, parked, and climbed the stairs to his unit. Inside, he bypassed the kitchen and went straight to the desk. He opened a worn book, the spine cracked from constant use. He found the page, traced a single line with his finger, and read it aloud to the empty room. A definite purpose gives direction to effort. He looked at his bank statement, the ink smudge showing exactly $200. He closed the ledger. The cycle of the night was over, but the real work had just begun. The $200 on the statement was a starting point, not a savings account. Jason sat at his desk and ran the math again, his pencil lead snapping against the paper. The numbers did not lie. To buy a house, he needed a down payment that remained out of reach. He closed the takeout menu on his counter and threw it into the trash. That night, he stopped buying food he did not prepare himself. He traded convenience for every spare moment. He walked into the shop the next morning and signed up for every extra shift on the board. Double shifts became his new baseline. 14 hours of driving, delivering, and returning to the base. His eyes burned by the end of every week, and his legs ached from the constant pressure of the gas pedal. He stopped seeing his friends. He stopped spending his earnings on anything that did not move him closer to his goal. When the fatigue hit him during the late-night hours, he gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white and kept driving. Every dollar he earned was a brick in a wall he was building, one shift at a time. The physical cost was absolute, but he did not slow down. 2 years of road time culminated in a single morning. Jason pulled his car into the bank parking lot, the engine cutting out with a final, shuddering metallic clank. He sat for a moment, his hands resting on the steering wheel, his palms damp from the heat of the day. He wiped them on his trousers and stepped out. The bank was cool, quiet, and smelled of polished floors and ink. He walked to the counter, his gait stiff from years of long shifts. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the check. His fingers trembled as he smoothed the paper across the marble surface. The clerk looked up, then back at the numbers, and tapped a few keys on the console. Jason held his breath, watching the cursor blink on the screen. The transaction was processed in seconds. He was handed a set of heavy metal keys. He turned and walked out, his steps lighter than they had been in years. He drove to the outskirts of town, past the familiar delivery routes, and stopped in front of a small, peeling house. The paint was chipping, and the windows were clouded with dust, but it was his. He walked up to the front door, slotted the key into the lock, and turned it. The door swung open, and he stepped inside to a new life. The first month was a test of patience. Jason spent his evenings scrubbing baseboards and tightening loose faucets in the small, peeling house. The work was endless, but he kept his focus on the goal. When the first tenant handed him the rent check, the paper felt heavier than the money he had earned from his pizza deliveries. It was a strange sensation, holding a payment he had not physically driven for. That evening, he sat in his sparse apartment, the check resting on his kitchen table. The temptation to upgrade his daily life was immediate. He could buy better food. He could fix the radiator in his own car. He could finally stop living in a state of perpetual restriction. He looked at the check, then at his bank statement, and pushed the urge aside. He stood up, walked to the bank, and deposited the entire amount into a high-yield savings account. He did not touch a cent of it. He went back to work, delivering pizzas through the night as if the rent check had never existed. He had set the cycle in motion, and he refused to break it. The rent money began to pile up, isolated and untouched, forming the foundation for the next acquisition. He was no longer just trading time for wages. He was building a system that functioned even when he was asleep. By the 4th year, the count reached 5. Jason sat in his car during a break, the springs of the seat poking through the worn material. Outside, the engine rattled with a rhythmic, dying metallic pulse. A coworker leaned into the window, eyes scanning the interior with visible amusement. He tapped the dashboard, laughing as a piece of plastic trim fell onto the floor mat. How long are you going to keep driving this scrap heap? The coworker asked. You have the cash, Jason. Get something that does not sound like it is breathing its last breath. Jason did not look up. He pulled a clipboard from the passenger seat, his thumb tracing the ink-stained addresses of his 5 properties. He held the list toward the window. The paper crinkled and marked with notes. I am not buying a car, Jason said, his voice level and devoid of apology. I am buying my time. The coworker blinked, the laughter dying in his throat as he looked from the clipboard back to the rusted hood. Jason pushed the door open, forcing the other man to step back. He stepped out onto the asphalt, checked his watch, and walked toward the delivery entrance. He left the car behind, a silent testament to his choices, and went back to work. Weekends were no longer for rest, they were for the grind. While others slept or gathered at the local tavern, Jason was in the crawl spaces of his properties. He scrubbed floorboards until his knuckles bled and replaced rusted faucets under sinks that had not seen a wrench in decades. The labor was heavy, but the paperwork was heavier. He spent his nights hunched over coffee-stained maps and municipal tax records, teaching himself the language of liens and interest rates. One Saturday, a notice arrived for a property he was tracking, a complex defies lien that threatened to erase months of savings. He sat on the floor of his kitchen, the documents spread out before him, pulses thudding in his temples. It was a make-or-break moment. If he failed to navigate the legal jargon, the deal would collapse. He did not eat. He did not sleep. He traced every line of the fine print, cross-referencing statutes until the sun began to bleed through the window. He found the loophole. He filed the paperwork by dawn. His body ached with a deep, bone-weary fatigue, but his mind was razor-sharp. He realized then that the system did not reward the lucky. It rewarded the one who refused to quit when the pressure peaked. He stood up, stretched his stiff limbs, and went back to the ledger. The tally reached 20. Jason sat at his desk, the ledger open, and realized the math had fundamentally shifted. For years, every property required his direct intervention, every leaky pipe, every tenant dispute, every tax payment. But now, the incoming rent from the existing 19 houses covered the down payment for the 20th. He was no longer pushing the boulder up the hill. The hill had started to move beneath him. He looked at the bank ledger, the figures growing with a velocity that felt foreign. The manual scrubbing of floors and the late-night plumbing repairs were becoming secondary to the movement of capital. He realized the system had become a machine. Each acquisition now fed the next, creating a self-sustaining loop that required less of his physical labor and more of his analytical oversight. He stopped looking for individual deals and started looking for clusters. The growth was no longer linear. It was compounding. He watched the transfer of funds on his screen, the numbers shifting from red to black in seconds. The machine was hungry, and for the first time, it was feeding itself. He closed the ledger, leaned back, and watched the clock. The process was now autonomous. He was the architect, not the bricklayer. The speed of his expansion began to climb, pulling away from the constraints of his own time. The final delivery was uneventful. Jason pulled his car into the parking lot, dropped the keys into the metal box, and walked away without looking back. The pizza box smell faded from his memory as he stepped into his office. He had no more shifts to work, yet he kept the hours. He treated every $100 as a soldier in his army. He did not spend on comfort. He did not buy luxuries. Every dollar was deployed into the next acquisition, a calculated strike against the next down payment. He expanded his reach, targeting overlooked corners of the city where the value was hidden behind neglect. His discipline was absolute. He analyzed market trends while the sun was still down, scouting for properties that required minimal repair but promised maximum return. The army grew. 30 houses, then 40. He monitored his cash flow with the intensity of a general watching a front line. Every rent check was a resource to be mobilized, instantly funneled into the next contract. He was no longer just managing houses, he was commanding capital. He moved from block to block, acquiring assets with a relentless pace. The machine he built was now a juggernaut, cutting through the market, securing one front door after another until the 50-property mark was within his grasp. The final contract sat on the desk. Jason dipped his pen, signed the bottom line, and pushed the paper across the table. It was done. 50 properties. He stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the street. The office was quiet. He returned to his desk and pulled out the master ledger. He started the tally, He added the equity of the first house, then the second, moving down the list of 50 addresses. He accounted for the current market value against the outstanding debt. He calculated the cash reserves. He checked the numbers twice. The sum total appeared on the paper. $1,003,400. He stared at the figure. The ink looked the same as any other, but the weight of it was different. He pushed the ledger away and leaned back. The math that had defined his life for 4 years had reached its destination. He had started with $200. Now, the total sat in front of him, verified and final. The shock did not come as a shout or a jump. It hit him as a sudden heavy stillness in the room. He had crossed the line. He looked at the ledger again. The $1 million mark was no longer a target. It was a fact. Jason turned his chair toward the wall. 50 brass keys hung there on individual hooks, each representing a front door he had secured through years of labor. He traced the metal with his index finger. There were no shortcuts in the metal. No inheritance hung from those hooks. Only the consistent, daily choice to prioritize assets over momentary distractions. He had spent his weekends under sinks and on ladders, scrubbing floors and tightening bolts while others rested. That was the foundation of the million. He closed the heavy leather ledger, listening to the snap of the cover. He stood up, pushed his chair in, and walked toward the office door. His hand hovered over the knob. He turned it. The door swung open, revealing the quiet street outside. He stepped across the threshold and kept walking. The air felt different. For the first time in 4 years, the schedule was blank. He did not look back at the office. He did not look at the keys on the wall. He walked toward the end of the block, his pace steady and deliberate. He was no longer working toward a goal. He was choosing his own destination.